Hello and welcome to the second part of this two-part presentation on the psychology behind stereotyping and prejudice. If you haven't already, I'd strongly recommend that you listen to the first part of this presentation, which focuses on stereotyping. It's not absolutely essential that you listen to that before you listen to this one. This topic of prejudice can be studied independently, but I think an understanding of stereotyping really does inform anybody's understanding of prejudice, and I will be making reference to certain aspects of the presentation on stereotyping when I'm talking about prejudice. So if you can look at that first part before you listen to this one or watch this one, I'd highly recommend it. In this second part, we're going to be focusing on the topic of prejudice. Now, I'll define what prejudice is a little bit further on, but a rough description would be that prejudice is about treating people differently based on their membership of a certain social group or category. And usually we're talking about treating them in a poorer manner or in a more hostile manner because of their membership of that group. What we'll try to do in this presentation is we'll try to understand some of the roots of prejudice. How do we come to sort of single certain people out and treat them in this way? We'll also talk a bit about things that trigger prejudice. These aren't so much individual events as other beliefs or other things that are going on, which when they come together with a stereotypical view of a particular group can produce prejudicial behavior towards that group. We'll also be applying prejudice and our understanding of prejudice to a particular form of prejudice, and that's homophobia. And we'll be looking at homophobia because it is a very important and often troublesome issue within education about how students treat each other, how people from the LGBTQ community are treated within education, and what as educators can we do to manage homophobia when we encounter it. Before I start talking about what are the things that trigger prejudicial behavior and what are the beliefs that might predispose us to act in a prejudicial manner, we first need to consider who is it that is likely to be the target of our prejudice. Now, it's not random. Although different people might be prejudiced towards different groups, whoever we pick to treat in this prejudicial manner, there's always a pattern to who we pick. And to understand that pattern, you really have to look back at a concept which I mentioned when I was talking about stereotyping, which is self-categorisation and the in-group and the out-group. Now, I don't want to go through it all again, but just a very brief summary. We categorise, meaning we place ourselves in a variety of different social groups, which is affect us saying, I think I'm like these people, I think I'm one of them. And we do this for lots of different groups. Sort of hobbies, family, work, social area, religion. We identify with these different groups. And when you identify with any group, you have a tendency to view the people within the group as being quite similar to each other because that makes the group feel more tight-knit and cohesive. And you also have a tendency to view anybody who isn't in the group, the out-group, which is basically everybody else, as being quite different from the in-group, because viewing them as being different is another thing that makes the in-group feel sort of unique and makes a clear boundary between who is in the group and who's not. If you're like this, you're one of us. If you're not like this, you're not one of us. Now, that in itself is not a bad thing. It's simply a thing we do in order to make the groups that we belong to feel more cohesive and have a clearer identity, which makes us feel happier to be part of those groups. But there's always a danger that once we start viewing another group of people as the out group, that we'll start to see them as being similar to each other, this out group. We'll start to imagine that everybody who's not in the in group, all these out group people, that they're similar to each other, they have a lot in common, and whatever they have in common, it's different from what the in group has. And once we start seeing a whole group of people, the out group, as being similar to each other, there's always a danger we may take that too far and start to imagine that everybody in the out group is virtually the same. They're all the same and they're all different from us. Once we start thinking that way, we start stereotyping, and that was something I talked about in the presentation on stereotyping. Now, stereotyping doesn't automatically result in prejudice, but it is a major step in the direction of prejudicial behaviour. What then tends to push us over the line, I'll be talking about this a little bit later in this presentation, is whenever the in-group feels that it is under threat. Now, it may be under threat from the out-group, or it may be under threat from somebody else entirely, or it may be simply in crisis. Something is going badly wrong in the in-group that's not because of anything else that anybody is doing, just a problem or a situation. When that happens, when things start going bad, we want the people in the in-group to pull together. We want everybody to kind of get behind the problem, whatever that problem is. And that can lead us to want to create even stronger boundaries between in-group and out-group, because again, that makes us feel like the group is more cohesive and pulling together. And we might want to create even greater social distance between the in-group and the out-group. We want to believe even more strongly that the out-group is very different from the in-group, because again, that's another thing that emphasizes the identity of the in-group and makes us feel more cohesive. So when we face threats and crisis, it pushes the things we're already doing, if you like, into overdrive, up a gear or up a notch. And as such, if we're already acting in a stereotypical, or viewing the outgroup in a stereotypical manner, it can then push us over the line to justify us treating this outgroup now in a prejudicial manner. And that's what we'll be looking at in this, the rest of this session. Before I go any further, I should make a point about the distinction between two concepts, prejudice and discrimination. Now, I've already talked about acting in a prejudicial manner, when technically that really should be referred to with a different term, discrimination. Because in most places where you'll read about it, prejudice is viewed as your emotional reaction or your emotional disposition or orientation towards the group, whether you like them or dislike them. And usually when most people are talking about prejudice, it's a negative emotion towards a particular group. But then in a lot of places where they write about this and do research about this, when they talk about the behavior being changed or affected by this person being in a group, they talk about that as discrimination. Now, for me, it's pretty clear that prejudice and discrimination are related. That it's almost, I can't conceive of a situation where you would discriminate against somebody without also being prejudiced towards them. And it's very likely that the way in which you discriminate when you in your actions towards them is going to be affected by your prejudices towards them. So if I'm talking about acting in a prejudicial manner, you can think of that as being the same thing as discriminating or acting in a discriminatory manner. There are some discussions about the difference between positive and negative prejudice and positive and negative discrimination. So, for example, some people do talk about it being possible that it's possible you might be prejudiced in favor of a particular group and you might discriminate in their favor. However, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the much more common use of prejudice and discrimination, which is negative. So when I'm talking about you being prejudiced, I'm talking about, or anybody being prejudiced, I'm talking about that person having a negative feeling about a particular group-based person based on their group membership. And when I'm talking about acting in a prejudicial manner or discriminating, it's going to be discriminating against somebody, usually treating them in a negative manner, again based on that person's group membership. Now I'd like to talk about three different things in relation to prejudice. Firstly, I'd like to talk about predispositions. Are there any beliefs that an individual might have which might cause them to view any one of the outgroups that they are aware of in a prejudicial manner? Secondly, I'd like to talk about triggers a bit more. I've talked about things that will trigger prejudice, but I'd like to expand on some of those, particularly on the role that frustration might have might play in triggering prejudice. And lastly, I'd like to talk about solutions. What can we do when faced with prejudice? What can we do to try and manage or minimize prejudicial beliefs in others, especially as an educator? Focusing on predispositions first, there are certain beliefs that researchers have found predict prejudicial behavior or prejudicial beliefs. So it's found that people who hold these beliefs and hold them strongly are more likely to then develop a prejudicial viewpoint of an outgroup. One of these beliefs is social dominance. And social dominance theory effectively says that if you inherently view certain groups as inherently superior and therefore view other groups as inherently inferior, you are much more likely to develop a prejudicial belief regarding the group you see as inherently inferior. So having that value system, which tends to assign superiority and inferiority to particular groups, goes hand in hand with being likely to view the groups you see as inferior. Typically outgroups, it's rarer for someone to view their own group as inherently inferior, more likely for them to view one of the outgroups in their life as an inherently inferior one. They're more likely to view that outgroup in a prejudicial manner. The other thing that seems to be, or has been said to be, likely to predispose you towards prejudice is if you view that your group is doing worse than it used to be, whereas another group that was doing worse than you are has caught up on you, or is doing better. So effectively, that viewpoint that a group that was previously further down on the social ladder or not doing as well, not as successful, is now doing better, whereas your group is doing the same or worse, can make you much more likely to develop a prejudicial viewpoint of the other group that's catching up on you. And this is described as relative deprivation. That even if your group isn't doing any worse, just the fact that the other group, which was doing so much worse than you are, has started doing better and is catching up on you, can trigger prejudicial, or can make you more likely to trigger prejudicial viewpoints of that group. Now, I have to stress that relative deprivation as a theory is a much more contested theory. There's more disputes about whether or not there's strong evidence to support this one. But I would say that in both cases you're talking about other beliefs which would be likely to support or be consistent with a prejudicial view of a certain group, make you more likely to engage in prejudicial beliefs towards that group. So if it fits in with your wider worldview that it's okay to be prejudiced towards a particular group, you're more likely to develop prejudices. However, it's not guaranteed that you will, and there's still usually certain things or events or circumstances which trigger prejudice. And I've mentioned some of these before. So for example, if there's a conflict between your group and another group, if you're either directly opposing each other or maybe competing for the same thing, same jobs, same resources, same opportunities, this can be very likely to trigger prejudicial views of the other group. And in a sense, the competition or conflict is then seen as a justification for being prejudiced towards them. It's okay to be prejudiced because they're the bad guys. You know, we have to win, or we have to be more successful than them, and therefore treating them, viewing them negatively because they are our competition, and discriminating towards them is okay because, you know, we need to do that to win. This is how we justify prejudice to ourselves. Another less common but equally important trigger for prejudice seems to be frustration. Now this is not surprising given that there's a lot of research out there linking frustration to aggression. The link between frustration and aggression, without going into it in too much detail, is that typically if we expect something but our expectations are not matching how things work out, we become frustrated. And then that frustration is itself a trigger for aggression. Now sometimes we will become aggressive towards the thing that is frustrating us. So for example, the laptop that isn't doing the thing it's supposed to be doing, or the machine that isn't working properly, we might get really angry with it. But it's also possible that if we can't or just don't happen to direct our anger towards the thing that's frustrating us, we can displace it onto something else. And as such, we can feel frustrations in one area of our life, and then that can be a trigger for prejudicial beliefs and discriminatory actions towards a particular outgroup, even if that outgroup isn't necessarily the cause of the frustration. Now, those are the things that are likely to trigger aggression, but I should point out that trigger prejudice. But I should point out that behind prejudice, we still see stereotyping as being one of the important factors. The stereotypical view of the group that we are prejudiced towards is usually a key component as well. Now, when we encounter a situation where an individual or group of people have a prejudicial viewpoint of another group and are discriminating against them, what can we do about it? Some of the earliest theories out there which have attempted to tackle this have looked at the idea of contact being a way to resolve the problem. That often groups that have a prejudice towards each other rarely come in contact with each other, or don't tend to minimize contact, and therefore the belief was that if you increase contact, it helps to get past the misconceptions about each other and the sort of inaccurate beliefs, and that will then produce more sort of positive feelings about each other. You'll start to see each other as basically okay, decent people, quite like me, and that this will reduce both stereotypical views and prejudicial beliefs. Now, when I was talking about stereotyping, I did mention that even just imagining a contact with a group that you have a stereotypical beliefs about can help to reduce the level of stereotypical beliefs about that group. So there is some evidence out there to suggest that contact will work. And some of the early research also supported this, suggesting that contact did seem to reduce prejudicial beliefs about another group. However, the level of effect was low. It didn't dramatically change levels of prejudicial beliefs. And so the original theory of contact alone was developed, and it then became that the contact, to be really effective at reducing prejudicial beliefs, needed to involve some kind of meaningful cooperation. So it wasn't enough to simply throw them together, the two groups. There had to be something that they were cooperating on, and that thing had to have some sort of importance or meaning to both groups. And if you could produce that, that would then genuinely have a noticeable impact in reducing prejudice. So there's some lessons there in terms of community groups and community coordination, that it has to be more than just bringing communities together. There needs to be some sort of meaningful cooperation. The other thing that tends to have an impact on levels of prejudice is education. And this is because, as I've said before, stereotyping is very much at the root of prejudicial beliefs. And so if you can tackle the underlying stereotypical view of the outgroup, you can sometimes reduce the levels of prejudice. Now, sometimes this may be simply correcting misinformation and misunderstandings about the outgroup, but you may also remember when I was talking about stereotyping that simply telling people about biases may not be enough on its own. You may also need to teach them methods of metacognition by which they can start to better understand their own thinking, spot when their biases are happening, and thus reduce their impact. And I think that kind of education, that kind of training, will both reduce stereotyping but also have a beneficial effect by reducing prejudice. Let's see if we can put some of these concepts into practice by applying them to a particular example of prejudice. The prejudice I've decided to focus on in this example is homophobia. And although not everybody would consider this to be a prejudice, I'm going to try and make a case that it is by showing you how it matches so many of the characteristics of a prejudice and the way that the things that predispose you and trigger prejudices seem to be similar to the things that predispose people and trigger homophobia. First question should be, is homophobia focused on a particular social group or social category? Absolutely. So it is about a particular group of people, and it is almost always the case that the people who are prejudicial towards this group are not a member of the group themselves. They view it as an outgroup, the other, not them. People who have prejudicial views of homosexuality tend to have stereotypical views of the homosexuality in the LGBTQ community? Absolutely. It's very regularly found that they have quite a stereotypical view of what a typical member of that group is like. That would only make the case then that they might stereotype, not necessarily prejudice. Is there evidence to suggest that people's homophobic views are an example of a prejudice? Well, let's think about predispositions. I mentioned previously that social dominance is an important part of most people's predispositions towards prejudice. If they tend to view a certain group as inherently superior and a certain group as inherently inferior, they're quite likely to develop a prejudicial view of what they see as the inferior group. Now, for a long time, homosexuals and homosexuality was viewed as inferior. There were arguments made both based on religion. It was viewed as a criminal act, which makes it the group that engages with it inherently socially inferior, a sort of underclass who are sort of lawbreakers and criminals. And I'm rather embarrassed to admit this, given that it touches on psychology, which is usually something I see as a force for bringing reason to the world. But in this case, psychology was guilty of classifying homosexuality as a form of pathology and including it in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, which is usually used to categorize various forms of mental illness. For a while, homosexuality was included in there, and that's a rather embarrassing chapter in psychology's history. But all of these were cases, sort of reasons why many people did, and some people continue to view homosexuality as inferior socially to heterosexuality. And therefore it's not surprising that the people who believe this are often also the same people who view homosexuality in a prejudicial manner. As well as there being predispositions which might explain prejudices towards homosexual groups and homosexuality itself, there's also a number of triggers for this sort of prejudice, which again line up with the kind of triggers we were talking about previously. So I said that, for example, groups are more likely to develop a prejudicial view if the group is in crisis. Well, you can trace the root of a lot of even current prejudices towards homosexual groups to the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. Now, this was a crisis that affected all of society, but as often happens in a crisis, it caused certain parts of society to seek out a scapegoat, someone to blame, and so they sort of developed a more stereotypical view of the homosexual community as promiscuous and thus more likely to spread this disease, and that justified a prejudicial viewpoint of homosexuals and homosexuality. It's interesting that the actual evidence statistics did not support the idea that AIDS was being spread within the homosexual community more than the heterosexual one. But confirmation bias is a tendency for people to remember as I said before, evidence that supports their stereotypes and forget evidence that disconfirm those stereotypes, and so people were more likely to remember famous individuals who were homosexual and who contracted AIDS as their way of justifying that, yes, this was a problem in the gay community as it was described back then. As well as individual crises like this, there are other triggers. So, for example, conflict, I said before, is a potential trigger for a lot of people towards prejudice. A conflict might be seen as an actual sort of fight between two groups, but it could also be seen as the threat of a fight, the threat of danger, or the threat of being attacked in some way. And so recurrent theme you see in a lot of people who have prejudicial view towards homosexuality is their belief that homosexuals are likely to sexually assault them, or more likely to sexually assault them than a heterosexual person is. Now, this sort of fear of rape tends to be grounded in another stereotype, a stereotypical view of men as being the sexually dominant ones who sort of assert themselves sexually, and that's in a man's nature, and therefore this stereotypical view of men then extends to homosexual men, particularly seeing them as predatory and likely to use their dominant sexuality to force their sexual desires on other people. There is a suggestion that the threat that some people see in homosexuality is a threat to their own sort of identity, a fear, if you like, that their own potentially hidden homosexuality might be revealed. Now, this is often a criticism aimed towards people who are very noticeably homophobic, that they probably are gay themselves and just ashamed of it. And while that itself can be a stereotype too often applied to everybody who's homophobic, there are cases, and there has been research to show that in some cases of people who are homophobic, they do show a greater positive reaction to sexual imagery depicting their same sex than people who are not homophobic. And this suggests that at least in some cases, some homophobia is triggered by a perceived threat that the existence of homosexuality might reveal that person's own homosexual tendencies, and so they, viewing it as a threat, they are prejudiced towards it. The other way in which the homophobia may be triggered is, as I said, competition. Now, previously I talked about this in terms of economic competition or competition of resources, who gets the jobs and so on. But another way in which two groups may compete is over the right to decide what is true, what is right. So religious wars have been fought over what is true and what is right. Many conflicts have been fought over two different viewpoints of what is true and what is right. But on a more social level of conflict, of competition, some people view homosexuality as a competitor for defining what is normal, what is acceptable, what is natural. And so their view of normality, they see homosexuality as a threat to that view because it is part of a competing view of normality. And often it's interesting that the people who are very hostile towards homosexuality dislike the sort of what it implies about what is natural, what is right, what is decent. And so what you see here is a competition between two groups, and there are different definitions of what is normal, and therefore that competition can lead to prejudice. Another way in which homosexuality is seen as a competitor is that it offers a competing view of gender identity. Many people who display prejudice towards homosexuals and homosexuality are some of those with very strong, sometimes stereotypical views of gender and gender roles. And so it's not surprising then that since many people who are homosexual are clearly redefining the boundaries of what it means to be male or what it means to be female, that their definition or their wider view of the male gender identity is seen as a competitor for a more traditional view of men and women based on heterosexuality. And so naturally, as competitions often will do, this can lead to one side viewing the other in a stereotypical and prejudicial manner. All of these, I think, make a very strong case for suggesting that homophobia is very clearly an example of a prejudice, and as such is predisposed and triggered by all the same things and the kind of things that we see as predisposing and triggering other kinds of prejudice. I want to talk now about how homophobia is a pretty recurring problem in many educational settings, particularly in schools, and how many commentators believe that homophobia is at the root of a lot of bullying behaviour towards people who are perceived to be part of the LGBTQ community. It's interesting that a lot of teachers will say that while they're much more sort of clear in their own mind as to what they need to do when they encounter examples of other kinds of prejudice, racism, sexism, or bullying based on those forms of prejudice, there's a less certainty and more sort of confusion among teachers over what is or isn't acceptable in relation to homophobia and where they do or don't need to take action. I think it's very easy to sort of simplify this from the outside. So in order to explore this, I want to put you in a position where you have to make some of the judgments that a teacher might have to make, not just in relation to homophobia, but a variety of situations. And to do this, what I've done is I've come up with a series of comments, things that you might hear a student say. And for each comment, I want you to make an initial decision. Do you think that comment represents an example of prejudice and bullying, in which case you need to act? Or do you think the comment represents just an example of banter, two friends saying things to each other, sometimes things that are rude or maybe even a bit inappropriate, but that are not, you think, examples of prejudice and bullying, and so don't need your action? So I need you to decide for each comment, is it prejudice? Does it need your action? Or is it just banter? Can it be ignored? Now, once you've made that decision, I want you to then explore how you made that decision. But let's first have a go at making the decision. Here's the list of comments that you've overheard students say. And in each case, I need you to make an initial, immediate, almost an instinctive decision. Is it bullying? Is it kind of prejudicial example of prejudicial behaviour, and as such do you have to take action, or is it just banter, and while you might sort of show disapproval, you don't have to sort of take a strong and forceful action on it because it's not as serious as bullying. Each case I want you to make a decision. Pause this recording to make up your mind, and then after you've made the decision I'll have a few more questions to ask you. So pause the recording and make a decision in each case. Is it bullying? Is it banter? Hopefully you've made the decision for each case and you've decided whether it is or isn't bullying. Now the next thing I want you to do is to, again, you want to pause the recording, but this time I want you to figure out, how did you make the decision? What, if you like, pushed you over the line one way or the other? Why did you think in those cases that you did think they were bullying? Why did those ones count as bullying? And for the ones you didn't think were bullying, that were just banter, maybe inappropriate but not too serious, how did you make that decision? Pause the recording and make up your own mind and see if you can come up with a set of rules that you might then be able to apply to other comments in the future to help you make this decision. Can you come up with a system in your own head that helps you decide whether a situation is a problem or not a problem and needs your action? Okay, now chances are there'll be a few things that you'll have that have influenced your decision making one way or the other. Firstly, one factor which impacts a lot of people's decision making in this situation is whether or not they think the comment is being said in sort of with the intent to be hurtful or with the intent to be cruel or insulting. And while I can understand why that influences a lot of people's decision making, it really shouldn't, because the issue here is not whether or not, not just whether or not the person speaking is trying to be hostile or unpleasant to the person they're talking to. We should also consider the possibility that using certain words and phrases represent a particular group in a stereotypical manner or in a prejudicial manner. Whether or not the person saying the words means it that way, or whether or not the person listening is going to be hurt and upset to hear the group represented in a stereotypical or prejudicial way, shouldn't matter so much to us. The fact that it's being done and can have that negative effect, not just on the person being talked to, but also on anybody else that hears it, is enough, should be the way we make the decision. So we need to think of wider than just the person who's being talked to and ask ourselves, if somebody else overhears that comment, what message does it send? And what message does it send if we don't act on it? Another factor which may have influenced your decision making is whether or not you yourself know much about the comment and its history. So for some of these comments you might be very familiar with the origin of the phrase and the negative associations that come with that history. An example where people are probably more aware of the negative history would be something like Mong. Shut it you Mong, where Mong is an abbreviation for Mongoloid, often a way to describe a group of people who were seen as less than human or not as evolved as the rest. And so if you're aware of that, you're more likely to view that phrase as negative. Another factor which may affect you is whether or not the phrase is widely used in your own circle and whether or not it's seen as a bad thing there. So, for example, don't have a paddy. This is a phrase that's very widely used in a lot of parts of the United Kingdom, and it's rarely seen as having any negative history that anybody needs to be concerned about. And yet, if you look into the history of the use of the term paddy to describe any group of people, but particularly the Irish, it has a really negative history. And in fact, the phrase "don't have a paddy" taps into stereotypical views of the Irish as being savage and not civilized, which was used to sort of justify the domination of Ireland by the British Empire. Now, most of the people who use this phrase have no idea of its history, and as such would be shocked to hear that it has such a negative history, but might then feel, well, is it a bad thing Still, I don't mean it that way. I don't have any negative views of the Irish, and neither does anybody else I talk to. And yet we have to come back to this question about whether or not the person you're talking to being happy or unhappy about what you say is really a reliable sort of yardstick to decide if something is right or wrong. Because there are many cases of people using extremely unacceptable racial slurs, but saying that the person they're talking to doesn't mind. And it's quite possible that the person they're talking to doesn't want to cause a fuss, wants to have a quiet life, or themselves doesn't know much about the history. As such, we need to be aware of the history of any word or phrase to really effectively judge how serious it is and whether or not we take action. And it's not enough to say, I don't mean it that way, or I didn't know it meant that, to then say that the phrase is okay. It may explain why they used it at that time, but I think once we are aware of it, we need to then make the decision based on that awareness, not on the ignorance that came before it. The final thing that a lot of people will have considered when looking at these phrases is whether or not the person saying them is part of the group that is being referred to. Are they themselves part of that group, or the person they're talking to part of that group? But again, it shouldn't really matter, because the impact that is had isn't just on the people who are being stereotyped or being described in a prejudicial manner. The impact is also on the beliefs and values of the people who use the phrase and who hear it. Even if neither of those people are part of the group, if they use the phrase and it becomes an acceptable phrase, it validates the beliefs and the stereotypical views and the prejudicial views that go with that phrase. And so even if nobody from the group being referred to hears it, it still has a negative impact by perpetuating the stereotype and the prejudice within the people who do hear it and do use it. Now, the sort of issues I raised on the previous slide about some of the ways that we dismiss people's prejudicial or stereotypical language because they didn't mean it that way, or they didn't know the history, or the person they're talking to isn't part of that group, or they are part of that group. I've been trying to show you there effectively that none of those are good enough reasons to be accepting of language which is stereotypical and which represents a prejudicial view or belief about a particular group. I also list on the slide here a number of other rationalizations that people will put forward. They will say, well, you know, I'm part of that group that I'm being referring to here. I'm Irish, so I can call them paddies. That's okay, surely. Again, I would argue that it's not. That even if you're a part of that group yourself and you don't mind, it's not a good enough standard to justify passing on and maintaining a stereotypical or prejudicial view of any group. Does that mean that I'm arguing in effect that we now need to take action on every single thing that people say? Obviously, I'm very aware of the practical difficulties there, that as an educator you have a limited amount of time and effort, so you tend to pick your battles, and so you may not feel that you've got the time or the energy, or you may feel it would be too disruptive to jump in on every comment you heard made, and you therefore will jump in on the ones you view as more serious. That is a practical decision, and that's a reasonably fair practical way to make that decision. However, I would argue that even on those situations where you feel you haven't got the time or the energy, or it's just too disruptive to take action, we should still be aware that the comment itself is prejudice, isn't acceptable, and is a problem. And therefore we might ask ourselves, well, at what point will I take action on that issue? Do I simply sweep it under the carpet and forget about it? Or do I decide that at some point now is the time I take action on this issue as well as the others that I've taken action on before? I think the idea of dismissing any kind of stereotyping or prejudice as banter and acceptable is very dangerous. And while we might pick and choose when we deal with each of the different issues and each of the different forms of prejudice and stereotyping we encounter, I don't think any of them should be sort of left off the end of the list or just shrugged at as being harmless. I think what I've been trying to show you over the last two presentations is that there is no such thing as harmless stereotyping. There's no such thing as victimless prejudice, that each of them always carries negative consequences for members of that group, whether or not they are physically present when the thing is said, whether or not they themselves have a problem with what's being said. It does cause a problem, and it will have negative consequences for them and others in that group if we allow the phrases to continue in circulation and allow the viewpoints that those phrases represent to remain unchallenged. This viewpoint that there is no such thing as harmless banter when that banter contains sort of stereotypical images of the homosexual community or homophobic viewpoints or phrases is something you see cropping up time and again in reviews and in research focusing on homophobia as a problem within the school system. Time and again they will tell you that any form of homophobia, no matter who's saying it or how they say it, is a problem and helps to maintain stereotypical and prejudicial attitudes towards homosexuality, and makes many schools a place where people who are in the LGBTQ community feel unsafe and unwelcome. As such, they would argue that you always need to take action. Now, when and where you take action, I guess that is a practical question, but we should never simply shrug our shoulders at it or think that it's harmless. As an activity, it might be worth simply in your own time considering what could be done. How could we take action on this matter? Now, I want you to pause the recording for a moment and consider some of the methods that have been put forward previously in this presentation and the previous one for reducing stereotyping and prejudice, and I want you to decide, come up with your own suggestion of an action based on something practical we've talked about before that could be done to manage or reduce levels of homophobia in a school. Pause the recording, come up with your own, and then I'll make a few suggestions on ones I can think of. Okay, there were a number of ideas that I put forward in the previous presentation and this one on how to reduce stereotyping and prejudice. One example was I mentioned in the previous presentation of taking the perspective of the group. So an educator might, as a class activity, ask the entire class to take on the perspective of somebody from the LGBTQ community and what it's like for them to, say, come to a new school or to meet new people. Similarly, I think that I mentioned before that reaffirming and emphasizing norms within your group which challenge the stereotype or stereotypical viewpoints would be another way to tackle it. So here, norms of tolerance and acceptance of everybody, no matter what their race or sexuality or creed or nationality, would be a thing that a school could do, and to explore why, not just to reaffirm that tolerance is important, but to explore why it's an important norm in our society, what function it serves and how it helps us all, would also be important. I think the other thing that could be done would be to challenge some of the predispositions that I mentioned in this presentation. So, for example, many people justify a view of the LGBTQ community as inferior, morally inferior maybe, to the rest of society based on past laws or actions by various religions or even the psychological community. And I think a teacher could put those past viewpoints in context, explain or try to help the students to understand why that was the viewpoint of that group at the time, but also how those viewpoints have changed. and how therefore it is unjust to continue to view the LGBT community as inferior in any way. And I think in tackling that, we take away one of the predispositions which might lead towards prejudice. In summary then, what I've tried to show you in this presentation is the way in which prejudice could be seen as an extension of stereotyping. That effectively this form of stereotyping that I talked about in the last presentation would be the first step, but that when stereotypical views then get mixed together with other predisposing beliefs about superiority and inferiority of certain groups, and are then triggered by a crisis or a conflict or a competition, that then gives rise to both prejudicial beliefs and feelings towards a particular group and discrimination, prejudicial behaviours towards that group. And I've explored how this plays out in one particular example, homophobia, both demonstrating that it is a prejudice, but also talking about ways in which the challenges teachers face in deciding how to act or when to act on issues like homophobia, and also talking about some of the practical actions that we can take to aim to reduce or manage any example of prejudicial beliefs or behaviours that we see in our students. I hope you found this interesting, and following this there's some slides on some general reading, and you'll find links to these in the comment section below the video, and references of course at the end. Thanks very much.